Dobre večer, Kiev. Good evening from Kiev in Ukraine. We're in the Ukraine capital for this special edition, which is marking the first anniversary of the war between Russia and Ukraine, or rather Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has been widely condemned internationally by almost everybody. The United Nations voting, of course, just recently to basically condemn that completely and call for peace and indeed for a Russian withdrawal. We're here in the National Museum of Ukraine to the Second World War, but it's evolved into a museum about the whole conflict and what's happening in the country today. We're surrounded by artifacts which basically echo what the whole country is going through. And when you consider that some 200,000 lives have been lost, at some estimates so far, one gets a sense of what a heavy time Ukraine and indeed many other countries are going through with the knock-on effect of what is happening here. Let's take a look at what's been happening today. Today, Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, has been presenting medals posthumously to the families of those who have fallen in this conflict. That will be military personnel as well as police personnel. Zelensky really saying that their lives and their sacrifice is something to be incredibly honoured. He said also earlier on that we need resources to have advantage on the battlefield. We'll have more on that later. There have been a number of commemorations today, including one in Bucha. Bucha, of course, is the place where war crimes have been committed. They are being investigated, of course. It was under Russian occupation. We'll have more on that story, of course, coming up. Meanwhile, on the ground in the east of the country, the fighting continues in and around Bakhmut, which has become a special place of focus for the battle right now. A war of attrition has been going on there since summer. We were speaking to a colonel who was just back from Bakhmut, who told us just a few hours ago about what he'd seen, what he'd lived through, what his men have been battling. And believe me, it is absolutely atrocious what they're going through, with scenes almost like those of the First World War. So this is our special programme to mark 1 year since the Russians launched their invasion. We've got our correspondents who are about to join us very shortly. They are Catherine Norris-Trent. She's in Mykolaiv. Catherine has been to Kherson for a special report from there. Good evening, Catherine. And Robert Parsons. Rob is in Kramatorsk. He's travelled extensively across Ukraine over the past 10 years or more. Rob will be bringing us his assessment of the situation very shortly. So let's tell you more about these premises that we're in right now. It is the National Museum of the conflict here in Ukraine, but also it's got a real history dating back many decades. Come with us through here into what is a special amphitheatre dating back to Soviet times. Take a little look around here, because this is the place where last year all the Ukrainian politicians came when the aggression started from Russia and they were looking to shelter. Volodymyr Zelensky rang and said, get back to work, get back to your offices, show the country, show the world that Ukraine is undaunted. It was the worst of times, in many ways the best of times, you might say. Gulliver Cragg, our correspondent, has brought us every development as it's happened. Gulliver, good evening to you, sir.
Good evening.
You've been speaking to a man who, I think it's fair to say, played a major part in saving the capital from the Russian invasion.
Well, I meant a few days ago to basically take another look at the battle for Kyiv. If you remember, a year ago today, a lot of people were thinking that Kyiv would fall in a matter of days. That's certainly what Vladimir Putin thought and was planning
72
for.
hours, yeah.
Yeah, and then there was this extremely intense battle, during which time I was not in Kyiv. I, on the second day, got out, as millions of people did, because, you know, we thought it was going to be too dangerous to be here. The Ukrainian armed forces managed to defend against these Russian attackers. And I went back on Monday, actually, not to the suburbs that people often visit and which have become quite well known, Bucha, Irpin, which suffered a lot of destruction, but to a place called Moshchun, a little bit further north. One of the commanders who was leading one of the brigades in the battle there took me there, and actually it's a whole different level of destruction that you see in Moshchun.
Gulliver, thank you. Let's take a look at Gulliver's report.
Driving out of Kyiv, Alexander Vdovichenko recalls the month he spent defending Ukraine's capital.
There were hardly any cars on these roads then. Checkpoints everywhere. And now there's life here. The President of the United States even came to visit.
Where we're headed, though, the destruction is more total. After Russian forces failed to cross the Irpin River at Hostomel, they set up pontoon bridges further north and tried to get to Kyiv via the village of Moshchun.
The enemy established positions at the western end of Moshchun. And from here, they fired on our units in the center of the village. You see how everything's destroyed here. But the enemy did not get any further. They came from over there, you see? They weren't able to bring in logistical support, like reinforcements and ammunition, fast enough. And here, they saw our resistance.
Resistance boosted by just a few Western weapons that he says had arrived just in time.
We had received javelins, stingers, and NLAWs. Of course, not in the quantities we would have liked. As they say, you can't get enough of a good thing. But we had them, and they played a significant role in our victory.
The triumph at Moshchun has given Ukraine confidence that it can prevail over Russia. But it's hardly a joyful place to visit.
When I come here, I immediately see before my eyes all the people who gave their lives in this very place. It's hard.
Gulliver Crag there, back in the museum. This is really evocative of what is happening. This, the actual area concerned, of course, in the east that we've been talking about. Let's move on to meet one of the representatives of the people here. She's Inna Sovson from the Holos Party, which is the opposition. But I sense right now there's very little opposition in Ukraine. People are united, really, against the aggressor.
Yeah, indeed, the situation over here is pretty much black and white. There is a clear enemy, and we're all fighting with everything we can, whoever can do whatever, just to help save our country at this point.
I have to ask you, because we're here amongst all this military paraphernalia, some of it is actually from battlegrounds. Your partner is out fighting for the country. When you're amongst all this, I'm wondering how you feel.
You know, I actually came here and I realized that the last time I have been here, I was here with my partner, my kid and 2 kids of his own. He has kids from previous marriage, and we were showing our kids around here and showing how it looks like and how the war looked like, because he actually fought in the war before in 2014, 2015.
Because people forget about that, don't they? Because I think the world forgets that this is something that hasn't just happened from last year, but it's been going on since 2014, maybe even before. Yeah,
indeed. It has been going on before, and that is why I'm a bit confused about this 1-year anniversary of the war, because indeed we are running 9 years of the war, and God knows how long that will last.
OK, Inna, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in our correspondent, Catherine Norris-Trent, who's reported extensively on the conflict since it began. Catherine Norris-Trent will be coming to us very, very soon. Let's come back to Inna Sovson for more reflections on this situation. Inna, you were talking about how this has affected your own family. I mean, clearly, let's move on to how it's affecting the people that you represent. I mean, clearly, people want to know when this is going to end. It's impossible to tell them.
It's impossible, and we should stop pretending that we know the answer to that question. There are some things I know for sure. It will end sooner if we have more weapons delivered sooner to Ukrainian army. I think within the last year, we have proven to ourselves, but also to the world, that giving weapons to Ukrainian army is actually the solution to the problem. That is actually de-escalating the war.
Nobody expected when Vladimir Putin said 72 hours will be in Kiev, it's finished.
Yes.
No one expected him to be wrong.
Indeed. 3 hours after the full-scale invasion, they were 20 minutes drive from my home. And
20 minutes from your home?
20 minutes drive. I live on the north of the city. That is where they were coming from. So yes, that is where they were coming. And they're nowhere near Kyiv now, right? Instead, we have visits from the foreign dignitaries from the Western allies of Ukraine. So we have proven that we can fight. And giving weapons to us is actually the best solution to end this conflict sooner than later.
Inna, thank you very much indeed. Bear with us, please. Let's now go to Catherine Norris-Trent, our correspondent, who I was just saying has covered this story extensively since the very beginning. She's been to Kherson, joining us now from Mykolaiv. Catherine, a very good evening to you. You've been back to Kherson. Tell us the kind of difference you feel between how it was then, how it is now.
Well, today the town of Kherson has pretty much emptied out, Mark. Local authorities there tell us that some 85% of the population has fled, and the streets are eerily empty, especially around this anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. People in recent days have been telling us they were fearful that even heavier bombardment was coming, because for the past few months, Kherson has been on the receiving end of lots of incoming Russian artillery and mortar fire, and it's been hitting around the city, especially those neighborhoods close to the river Dnipro, which is the only thing that divides Kherson at the moment from the Russian troops who retreated across that river under pressure from the Ukrainian army in November. But there have been targets hit all around the city, and in fact one military official today told me that a hospital in Kherson had been slightly damaged by shelling. We heard loud explosions there, intensifying into the afternoon. So an extremely precarious situation for the people who remain there. We've seen large queues of people gathering at a humanitarian aid distribution point, and some of them telling us that they've been very cold this winter, that they have problems with electricity, that they have problems getting enough to eat. The economic activity of the town has slowed down a great deal, of course. So life has been very hard for people there, despite this town having lived through more than 8 months of Russian occupation and having resisted. You can look more at the situation in Kherson in this report, which we filmed in the past few days, along with my colleagues Karim Yayaoui, Mohamed Farat and Dmytro Kovalchuk. The devastation at Kherson airport is a reminder of the fierce fighting to retake this city. A zone still mined, now surrounded by defensive Ukrainian trenches. But the battle to push forward is frozen.
It's positional warfare, trenches, artillery and drones. We're divided by the Dnipro River.
The front line runs along the river. The edge of the city is deserted and perilous. From the other side, Russian troops send barrages of artillery, machine gun and sniper fire, and Ukrainians strike their positions in turn. Caught in the crossfire are those left of Kherson's population. Every day people queue for hours at an aid point, handing out food and winter clothes. Outside, waiting in freezing temperatures as explosions ring out, the crowd is growing impatient.
I came here yesterday at 4:30 in the morning to join the queue, but I didn't receive anything. I won't get anything today either.
There's always shelling. It's every day. My nerves can't take it anymore.
For the past 4 months, Kherson has endured daily indiscriminate shelling, emptying the city streets. When Russian troops were forced to withdraw from Kherson in November, this central square was full of celebrating crowds. But that euphoria is long gone. The hardest hit neighborhood is Ostriv, an island on the Dnipro River. Still under Ukrainian control, but the Russians are just a few hundred meters away. Despite all the dangers, this couple is determined to carry on as best they can.
We're staying. It is very frightening. The bombs fly around chaotically. I don't even know where we're coming from. The people who are left here are the most resistant. Firstly, we're worried about what could happen to our homes, and people are patriotic. They don't want to.
A handful of inhabitants are still holding out. We meet the few remaining residents of this tower block, twice hit by shells.
Where would I go? Anyway, there are looters, health problems. I don't have enough money. So where would I go? And who would take me?
To stay or pack up and go, a heart-wrenching decision. Around 100 people leave Kherson by bus every day. Some 85% of the city's population has now fled. Today, the driver's anxious. His minibus has just been hit by shrapnel. Ready to board, a mother and daughter from the neighbourhood of Ostriv.
We waited until the last moment in the hope something would change, but we can't bear it anymore. We love our city, we love our home, and we're planning to come back here. We're not leaving forever.
When Ukraine took back Kherson, there was a national outpouring of pride. But the battle is far from over in the south, with the danger not driven far away.
Catherine Rose Trent, our reporter, is still with us. Catherine, thank you for that. Tell us what the people in Kherson need right now.
Well, Mark, something I really want to underline as well is the resilience of the people in Kherson and the wider Kherson region. The parts that we have visited where the Russian troops withdrew, were pushed back by the Ukrainian army. The damage there is very extensive, but people are already coming back to those villages in small numbers at the moment, expected to get bigger into the spring, to try and rebuild their lives. And that's a big challenge because they need the electricity to be put back on. Some of them have been without power now for basically a year. Lots of homes have been destroyed, their roofs blasted off, so they've covered them in plastic sheeting, but clearly getting through the cold winter weather is a massive challenge for them. So they need extensive help repairing these buildings and getting them watertight again. They need food, basic services aren't running. You've got some mobile shops, vans and such like, driving around these remote villages. And then people need to get back to work. Kherson is a largely agricultural region, and farmers we met says that they're not allowed, they're not supposed to be going out to sow the next season's crops in the field because they are still mined. So of course we've heard a lot about the grain crisis, the export crisis in Ukraine, and next season that could be a huge problem too, because the farmers of Kherson province in the south of Ukraine really want to get back to work, but at the moment it's too dangerous for them to do so.
Catherine illustrating how it is very much a multi-layered conflict. Catherine, thank you very much indeed. Let's come back now to Ines Sovson here in the museum. We're amongst all these artefacts of the war. You've mentioned about your own family's involvement. We see the report. I'm looking at your faces going out. I feel heartbroken watching that. How do you feel?
You know, I'll tell you this. The other day I picked up my son from school and I asked him, how was your day? Like any mother or father would do. And he looked at me and he said, you know, it was a pretty good day. We only had one air raid alert. And that struck me. That is not how I want.
How old is your son?
He's 10.
10 years old.
4th grade. So this is not how I wanted my child, but the childhood of my kid to go. And then there are millions of other kids who are separated from their parents. There are kids, of course, who lost their parents. There are kids, which is probably most heartbreaking, who have been abducted by Russia and are taken to Russian Federation in unknown locations. So this is indeed very difficult for us to accept. But I also have another wisdom to share from my son. The other day, when Joe Biden came here to Kyiv, I met my son in the evening and I said, do you know who came to Kyiv? And he said, yes, I know, Joe Biden. Dad told me already by that time. And I asked him, how do you think why Joe Biden came to Kyiv? He looks at me and he says, you know, I think he came because we are unstoppable and we continue to fight.
That's the resilience that I think many people are really waking up to about Ukraine.
Yeah.
You mentioned that children have been abducted.
Yes.
6,000 according to the Yale investigation on that one, sponsored by the US State Department. 6,000 perhaps is just the tip of the iceberg.
Indeed, just like any other numbers, the number of casualties is also very, you know, the very minimum that we can definitely prove, but the numbers are probably bigger. But we know that this is a massive issue. I'll give you an example, which is just so hypocritical, I can't even imagine that. Russia has the Children's Rights Commissioner, and the Children's Rights Commissioner of Russia adopted one of the children that they have abducted from Mariupol, and she's running around Russian television saying that she's such a good person and she encourages everybody else to do that. Just imagine that, a country official saying that, hey, there are other kids for grabs, you know. This is unbelievable. This is so heartbreaking. I can't believe what the parents of those kids feel, or if they don't have parents but they have other relatives. Majority of them have relatives. It's just heartbreaking.
And Russia admit that these children are being put into
basically
re-education camps. It's basically brainwashing.
Exactly, and they've been trying to do that even in the occupied territories in Kherson. I've seen a heartbreaking video on September 1st. The new school year begins, and they have put a few kids that are left in Kherson. Majority have left, of course. They have put them, and they've forced those kids to wave Russian flags and to sing Russian anthem. And I'm looking there. There are kids who are 14, 15, 16 years old who have grown up, lived all their life in Ukraine. And suddenly they've been forced, basically raped into singing Russian anthem and praising the person who's been killing his friends, relatives, neighbors, and so on and so forth. They're doing that. They're brainwashing the kids. Act of genocide in itself, part of their big agenda to destroy Ukrainian nation.
Indeed, it's worth pointing out before I leave you into that this idea of the re-education camp comes from Russia's own literature. It's not something that we are characterising. It's what Russia's actually described it as. Ina Sovson, thank you very much indeed. Keep well and keep doing your excellent work to help all the people around you. Ina Sovson, opposition MP here in Ukraine. Let's turn to the issue of war crimes. Bucha is a place which is synonymous with that very phrase because of what happened a year ago. Today there's been a commemoration for those who lost their lives, the victims, and there are so many. We can show you what happened in that time. And clearly a great deal of sadness in Bucha, a place which is still trying to heal after what happened last March. I went there to take a look at how people are and to listen to some people who saw what happened. Here in Bucha, it was discovered that some 400 people or more were killed during the Russian occupation. War crimes investigations are underway. Evidence gathered by civilians like Denis Davidov are essential. Denis, thanks for agreeing to speak to us. Show us what you found. Show us what you saw.
The 1st of April, I came here to the streets to visit a friend, but I saw many Ukrainians who'd been killed. They were lying over there with their hands tied. They'd been shot in the head. I have the photos that I took that day. You can see here the same billboard that says townhouse. And here you can see the innocent people who were killed by Russian soldiers.
It's like after a robbery or a rape. We wanted to put everything in the laundry and clean it up with bleach, so nothing would remind us of the Russian presence here.
You must have been seeing that, incredibly afraid, frightened.
I already wasn't afraid. 1 year of war puts you in such a state that walking among dead bodies, you only think about where you're going to hide if you see Russian soldiers. I'm not afraid of Russians, they're afraid of themselves. They brought so much suffering to my close ones, my friends, and very severe retribution awaits them. They will pay the price of their acts of terror and their acts of genocide.
Yablunska Street here in Bucha looks today like any other, but all the fences, all the gateposts have signs of Russian bullets. And indeed, this entire roadway a year ago was strewn with bodies, civilians shot dead by Russian soldiers. But Bucha isn't the only place with war crimes to be investigated. The regions of Kharkiv and Kherson have their stories to tell too. Welcome back to the museum here in Ukraine. Just to remind you, it's very much a living, breathing museum, even though it's honouring those, many of whom have lost their lives in battle. Joining us now is our next guest, Peter Zlamayev from the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Peter, great to meet you in person.
Pleasure.
We've spoken many times
Indeed.
over this year on France 24, and we've always appreciated your analysis. We're standing among certain things which clearly suggest the type of things that might concern you. I know you're obviously concerned with war crimes, you're concerned with how military issues are used. We have a drone beside us, used for spying, shot down over the Donbass. An interesting paint job done in traditional Ukrainian fashion to kind of, I don't know, make it seem like a more humble and domestic thing, but nonetheless, these kind of things, I mean, you see that sort of shell, when that goes through a house, through a school, what kind of damage are we talking about? What kind of damage does this do?
I mean, this will probably take out an entire room, you know, and this reminds me of the fact that something we overlook, I mean, as the war goes on, just the staggering environmental damage that it has caused Ukraine. Even, you remember, General Chancellor Scholz said a few months ago that just to demine Ukraine will take tens of decades, you know. I mean, the toll is staggering on people, on the environment, on animals, on air, on everything.
In terms of war crimes, what we're looking at here, we've just seen a report from Bucha. What happened there, without going through the whole process, you just have to put two and two together. It is clearly something which is atrocious. And it's happened in repeated places across Ukraine. Do you think you'll ever be able to cope with it, to get it through to justice? Do you think those responsible will be actually brought before any kind of court?
What you just said, it pains me probably the most. The fact that we are increasingly living in completely different informational universes, different informational narratives. The Russian Federation has created a veritably alternative universe inside their country, where whatever happened in Bucha was a fake, it was a theater play, it was staged, and daily I go on various TV channels, including in India, for example, where the anchor will start his question like, when Ukraine decided to attack Russia, and when Ukraine decided to fake the atrocities in Bucha, this is what's literally, like, figuratively speaking, killing me, is that, you know, the entire, I mean, I wouldn't say the entire population, but a sizable part of the Russian population do not even believe that their army is capable of these atrocities. From the very start of this terror campaign against Ukraine, this war, which we start from 2014, and the downing of MH17, you remember, Russia has denied any responsibility for the actions of its army. It has essentially unilaterally abandoned, you know, the system of law and order, international law. It has refused to abide by these standards. Eventually, justice will prevail. The question is how long it will take. We have the precedent of Germans after World War II. It took a sizable part of the German population until the 60s to fully come to terms with what was wrought in their name.
Indeed. Peter, for now, bear with us. Let's bring in our Chief Foreign Editor, Robert Parsons. Rob is in Kramatorsk, where one of the possible worst, I think, atrocities, well, I don't just think, it's something that the international authorities think, one of the worst cases that was committed took place. Rob, I hope you can hear us. Obviously talking about what happened at the railway station back in April.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Ukraine at the time, Mark, not this part of the Ukraine. I was right on the far other side in the western Ukraine city of Lviv when the news came through. Actually, we were expecting a train to come through with internally displaced people, and we were at the station in Lviv waiting for that train when the news started to come through that the station in Kramatorsk had been attacked and that so many people had died. And one of the most horrific incidents in this war, and certainly at that time the most horrific incident. Gradually after that, people started to trickle through on trains that came after, and so we started to get the whole story. But it was truly awful.
60 people are killed. I think that's probably a very, very conservative estimate, Rob.
Yeah, I think it probably is a conservative estimate. There were just hundreds of people gathered both inside the station and outside the station when the artillery shells started coming in, and they had no chance whatsoever. They were just the shrapnel from the shells coming in to the area in front of the station. I've passed it several times over the course of the last 24 hours. It was just awful. No chance of escape at all. They were just shredded by shrapnel in many cases, and died on the spot. You know, the first aid workers tried to do what they could, but it was a bloodbath.
Rob, thank you very much indeed. Robert Parsons in Kramatorsk. Let's come back to Peter Zalmayev of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Peter. Mariupol, what's happened in Kharkiv?
There with Peter Zalmayev and France 24's Mark Owen there in Kyiv. It's live television. We're going to try now to reconnect with Mark and his guest.
We've lost the link.
Oh.
Welcome back, Francois Picard there, just keeping us in the picture now. We're back live in Kyiv with Peter Zalmayev of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Peter, we were talking about Kramatorsk, our chief runner to Robert Parsons, describing what happened at the station. I asked you whether in the other occupied places of Ukraine, whether, and this is the frustrating thing, I suppose, from everybody's perspective, things have happened. Will people ever be made to face justice for those things they've done?
First of all, all these atrocities have a special meaning to me. Kramatorsk, I grew up in Donetsk, and my grandma lived in Slavyansk. All these towns are on the way from Donetsk to Slavyansk. I used to pass by them. Some of my relatives live there. So all of this is very painful. When you talk about Mariupol, we still don't know the full scale of the atrocities there. We have reports that Russians were using portable crematoria to burn victims. They're now
hiding the evidence, basically.
Exactly. They're now reportedly burning their own fighters, including from the Wagner group. But we heard that early in the war they were trying to hide the evidence. We don't know the scale of what happened, but by all accounts, it's pretty staggering. Nothing like what was happening in 2014 and 15. I referred earlier to the precedent of MH17. I was struck when Putin went on air after that tragedy. I was very naively hoping that there would be some kind of coming to terms and let's stop this and this. No. I was disabused of any of my hopes. For as long as Vladimir Putin is in power, the only thing that keeps him in power is the system of lies as official policy. No reckoning with the past for as long as this guy.
Because in the past week he said, of course, that it was Ukraine and the West that caused the conflict.
Exactly.
That's what he said, which clearly is not true. Not true at all. You mentioned MH17. A friend of mine was on that flight.
Oh, gosh.
It's an appalling thing to have happened, and one would have thought that would have changed the whole sort of sense of it.
Exactly. I had that feel, and to me, that it just encapsulates. That's a tragedy, and the majority of the dead were not even Ukrainians. But that encapsulates to me the entire tragedy of this war.
You also mentioned the Wagner mercenaries. Their role appears to have changed from, if you like, trained killers, trained fighters to cannon fodder. How does that happen? And does this represent some kind of breakdown between...
In the 21st century, you wonder, right? And we are seeing this breakdown and these guys coming to blows with the regular army, etc. And Ukrainian officials have said things to the effect that we kind of welcome that. It shows that there's disarray, and it really exposes Vladimir Putin for not just the ineptitude of this campaign, but the fact that he never even prepared his populace, despite the propaganda for this war. The generals went in without knowing the scale of what was awaiting them. A lot of soldiers didn't even know they were in Ukraine when they were sent there. And I think that's all you need to know about, this operation and the way it's been, prosecuted. And this, I think, the deep inside, the shame of the soldiers themselves, of the generals, and maybe even Vladimir Putin, deep down the understanding that this is not a righteous war. This is not anything like World War II. This is fitting that we're meeting here in this World War II museum that's been converted into the museum of, the heirs of the invading army. It's now the Russians who are playing the role of the invaders. The irony is very thick, and I think deep down Russians understand that this is not a righteous war. I mean, at least that's my hope. Maybe I'm naive once again. But, you have to sort of cling to some sort of, humanity, even in your enemy. If we're ever to come to terms with each other, if we're ever to live in peace again, it can only come through reconciliation and coming to terms with the past.
Peter Zalmayev, speaking from the heart, thank you very much indeed for sharing your time with us. It's always a pleasure to see you. Peter Zalmayev of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Peter's from the Donbass. Our next report is from the Donbass. Robert Parsons went there, met a group of fighters involved there near to Donetsk.
7 kilometers behind the front line in the Donbass, Ukrainian tank crews take their orders for the day ahead. The snow ensures that no Russian drones are around to target their positions. Hidden beneath the sparse tree cover, this tank forms part of a second defensive line, ready to leap forward into attack if the Russians break through Ukrainian positions. But the tank crew is frustrated by its limitations.
In its day, this was a very good tank and its technology was top secret. But now it's old and difficult to fight in. Look, it's as old as I am, and I'm no spring chicken.
Inside, conditions for the three-man crew are cramped. Room here for the driver only. Their commander says everyone is focused on victory, but he's desperate to see the German Leopard tanks that have now been promised to Ukraine.
The main issue is those Western tanks. If we get all the tanks our commander-in-chief has asked for, we can completely change the intensity of our fighting. And we can drive them out of our country. We really need those tanks.
With the Russian offensive expected here any time, the commander has to make the best of what he's got now. These old Soviet-era tanks have to be ready. They take the T-64 on a test run to put it through its paces. Battle ready once more, it resumes its position beneath the tree cover. They have to check that another tank is in working order. It was in combat less than a week ago and has destroyed 5 Russian tanks since the war began. But it's in need of constant repair. This is a T-64. It's the main battle tank in the Ukrainian army. A good, solid tank, but more than 50 years old in many cases, which helps explain why Ukrainian tank crews spend 70% of their time repairing them. Time to take a break from the cold. This crew are fortunate. They can take shelter in a house in a nearby village. Others have to dig their own shelters in the open fields. It's a roof over their heads, but for 7 men, the conditions are cramped and temporary.
Since the start of the war, we haven't been able to stay in one place for more than a few days. It's too dangerous for the soldiers and the machines. The longer we stay, the faster the Russians can find us.
Constantly ready to move, constantly under stress. Small comforts are all they have.
I hope we can force the Russians out by the end of spring. With the help of God and our partners, we'll expel them from our country. Then we will live in peace and return to our families.
Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, reads the slogan scrawled across the wall. More poignant are the pictures drawn by their children. They haven't seen their families for 4 months. When they're sent out into combat, these pictures on the back of the front door are a reminder that someone's waiting for them back home.
Let's bring in Robert Parsons once again for more on this story. Rob, the men you met, under-resourced, but nonetheless they have that resolve in their soul which might defy all odds.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Mark. You've really hit the nail on the head there. They're absolutely determined. I met several men in that unit, and the story we got from them was always the same, that they were determined, that they knew they could do the job, that it was very difficult with the equipment that they had, but if they got the equipment that they were demanding, those tanks that we were talking about in that package, in particular the Leopard tanks from Germany, then they were absolutely sure that they could push forward, get through Russian positions and ultimately force them out of the country. And I'm sure they will be encouraged by the news coming from Poland today that the first Leopard tanks have come into Ukraine, and news too from Sweden that they're sending another 10, possibly a little bit less, but maybe 10 Leopard tanks in the very near future. So the beginnings of what they're demanding are already happening. They're looking for at least 100 Western tanks, and it looks possible now that by the end of this month they may just get them.
Robert Parsons, thank you. as always, very much indeed. Robert Parsons joining us from Kramatorsk. Peter Zamayev is still with us. Peter, Rob was talking about the first Leopard tanks coming to Ukraine, something that, of course, many people have been asking for and many people will be applauding. Is this going to be enough? President Zelensky is saying today resources are needed to have battlefield advantage. Will the Allies deliver?
Well, first of all, I have to say that in times of war, there's a proliferation of armchair soldiers and generals. I don't profess to be a military expert, but I just came from the Munich Security Conference, and I was actually at a press conference with Zelensky an hour ago. And obviously, in times of war, there's never anything, nothing is ever enough. The thing is that Vladimir Putin is really angling for some kind of a freezing of the conflict. We hear signs, signals from the Russians that they may be willing to sit down and talk, but that's only with the purpose of freezing it at the current front line, in order to rebuild their army, in order to have some breathing space and then attack Ukraine again. Vladimir Putin has not given up on his maximalist goal of invading Ukraine, controlling it, or short of that, just destroying it. This is exactly what he's doing. And so the argument is that Ukraine needs to get as many weapons and as fast as possible to be able to stage a successful counteroffensive, maybe break through this land corridor that leads from Russia to the Crimea, and reach some kind of a state from where it would be advantageous for Ukraine to sit down and talk. Right now, we're just simply not there. And so the argument is get Ukraine as much as possible. Stop worrying about Putin's red lines. If Ukraine needs F-16s, give them F-16s. Start training pilots. Give them ATACMS. Stop worrying about Putin's intentions.
Peter Zamayev, thank you very much indeed. Let's turn to another really urgent topic here in Ukraine. That is the nuclear issue, because not only is there Chernobyl, which of course has been captured by the Russians at one point and unearthed all kinds of nuclear reactive issues regarding soldiers burying into the ground around that area, but also Ukraine is home of the biggest nuclear power station in Europe at Zaporizhia. And many times Zaporizhia has been under threat, at risk from the fighting. More than one international figure, including Rafael Grossi of the International Atomic Energy Agency, has called for fighting to be stopped completely around Zaporizhia in order to protect the reactors there. So clearly this is an ongoing issue. Vladimir Putin hoping to get hold of that power station and use its power to be tapped into the Russian energy network. Robert Parsons, let's go back to you, sir, and get some kind of insight on the situation there. Now, clearly, Zaporizhia remains a very dangerous pawn in this deadly game that's being played.
Absolutely. People obviously in Zaporizhia, they're aware of the Enerhoda nuclear power station and the potential threat that comes from there, particularly as parts of Ukraine, like the city of Nikopol, which is just across the Dnipro River from the Enerhoda station, repeatedly comes under shell fire. And at least according to the Ukrainians, much of that shell fire comes from the territory of the nuclear power station itself, which invites counterfire from the Ukrainians. They try to avoid doing it, but it must be very tempting for them given the fact that their cities are being hit. Speaking to people in Zaporizhia about this just the other day, a girl who was working in a coffee shop, we asked her, aren't you frightened of the possibility of nuclear pollution from the power station if there is an accident or if a shell should land on it? And she said, yeah, well, obviously, all of us are aware of that, but it's one of those things that we feel is completely out of our power. There's nothing we can do about it, so we just have to effectively forget about it and live under the threat that it may happen, but just hope that it doesn't.
Robert Parsons in Kramatorsk, thank you very much indeed. The situation at Zaporizhia is one that everybody around the world is watching and waiting to see what happened. Back here in the museum, we're in front of the section which deals with the Minsk agreements, which sought to resolve the crisis. And of course, they've been widely ignored by the Russians, and that's why we're ending up in this situation we are today. Our next guest has, a number of things to say, but also an insight into what President Zelensky might be thinking. Yulia Mendel. Great to meet you. Thank you for joining us. You were, of course, the attaché de presse, the press secretary of Volodymyr Zelensky. At this present moment in time, can you give us any insight into what might be going on in his head?
Well, Mark, first of all, thank you for having me. And we all were watching the president's press conference today. And I must say, when I was working with him, I saw him multiple times in crisis. And I know during crisis, he works 24/7 and he gives all of himself towards this crisis. He's very demanding to himself. And imagine that this is the crisis that has been ongoing already for a year. And definitely this is very physically exhausting. But also I know that this is the person that never gives up. I remember his wife, Olena Zelenska, once said that he's a very persistent person. He never gives up. And this is exactly why Ukraine is lucky today to have such a leader who leads us in war against the biggest, autocracy, the most aggressive autocracy today. And he will not give up.
One of the things that you mention in your book, Fight of Our Lives, which is a great summary of your time, but also the run-up to this war and what's happening right now, is the issue of corruption in Ukraine. It's something you're very open about, and it's refreshing to hear someone talk so openly about that. In the next phase of what happens, the rebuilding of Ukraine, the refurbishment, the expansion, how important is it to get that corruption thing really suppressed and try to get rid of it?
When I was thinking how to name the book, the fight of our lives came up to my mind, not only just the fight as a war. It's also the fight for democracy here inside the country. It's the fight for the reforms to join the European Union. And of course, it's the fight against corruption, because I myself was doing this in multiple ways. And there were definitely cases of corruption that were mentioned and that were big scandals around the world. They were mentioned in many media this year. But let me say, it's very difficult for such a country as Ukraine, a country in war, a post-Soviet country, to recognize that we have corruption. But corruption exists around the world. Perhaps, only such countries as Russia can say we don't have any corruption. But we do know they do have, right? And it was very difficult for us. We know that someone can accuse us. But you should understand that we want to admit our mistakes to show that we want to be different country. We want to be transparent country. We want to be really European Union country. And for this, we need to admit mistakes. And we need actually to maintain this issue, to become as much transparent as possible.
Yulia, there is much more to talk about, but on this issue of corruption, I'd like to go now to a man that I met a day ago. His job will be to basically direct the refurbishment, as he calls it, of Ukraine after the war. But of course, it begins right now. I met him on the Maidan Square. Let's take a look at our conversation. We're here on Maidan Square in Kyiv with Mustafa Naim. Mustafa is the head of the Agency of Restoration for Ukraine. You were very prominent in the original Maidan demonstrations in 2013, right here, which began the whole process. Did you ever imagine you'd be at this stage, at war?
Of course not. We didn't expect that moment. Now I understand that it was something very natural, because for me it was start of our fight for freedom, that moment. Historically, it is not something which happened that day. I think this day was prepared for centuries, because Ukraine is the longest period of independence we have now. During many centuries, many empires around us tried to occupy Ukraine, and it was start of the fight for freedom. And that moment, we didn't feel that will be so huge changes in our country and around our country in the world.
The estimated damage to the country so far, $138 billion. But you're in charge of restoring Ukraine. How do you begin that? Well, you're still at war, aren't you?
Actually, that's the point, that we are not talking now about restoration. We're talking about survival stage of the restoration. And we should do everything now to restore our critical infrastructure, roads and bridges, not to stop all our cargoes for the front line for people. And from the other side, that we was affected our energy sector, energy grid, huge, tremendously, last 4 months. So for this year, we'll focus on the critical infrastructure, roads and bridges, and electricity grid, and building up shelters for our electricity, and of course the residential areas, because many people lost their houses. But I think in the future, we should have big strategy and plan to rebuild country, rebuild it better than what we had before, because we don't want to rebuild again Soviet Union. We need expertise for that, we need money for that, and of course we need people who can come and help us with this. From the other side, I see how many people now want to help us. You can't even imagine how many people doing themselves what they can do on the local level and the central level. So for us, this moment is just moment to focus all our efforts to survive and to fight and to win.
Mustafa, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mustafa Naim, who I spoke to on the Maidan Square, he, as we just heard, was one of the original people protesting back in 2013. And Yulia, of course, as you know, that's what led to, in many ways, the situation we're in today, with Ukraine actually standing up for itself, forcing out a corrupt pro-Russian president. And then the whole thing just seemed to sort of spiral and go further down and further down. The West, I think it's fair to say, didn't stand by Ukraine in 2014. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think they stood, but they had their limits, you know, and definitely it was not enough. If it were enough, then we wouldn't have this large-scale invasion and all those atrocities here right now. But we hope that now the West and actually the civilized world sees what Russia is. Russia covered its face very well with disinformation and propaganda.
Well, that's one of the issues, isn't it? And you deal with it in your book very, very, very well, I think. The fact that there are these ways of using social media to manipulate many situations. We've seen it in the US election, the French election, the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, and, of course, in relation to what's happening now between Russia and Ukraine.
So, look, Russia is a golden champion of lies and propaganda. And Ukraine was a testing platform for all its instruments. So Russia was very generously making this hybrid war, actually, using word as a weapon. And first what Russia did, actually, it's faked journalism, then it faked diplomacy, and now it tries to fake democracy. So for us, it took really a lot of efforts to fight this disinformation, because disinformation is very tasty. Disinformation fakes, they are playing with your emotions, they are playing with your fears, they make you panic, and also they are very easy, they are very simple. Though when you look on the truth is always more complex, right? And it's like more boring. That's why fakes, they are more attractive, and Russia plays with you and tries to divide the society. And now we see that Russia plays with democracies around the world, and especially in the West, trying to use all those instruments that it used in Ukraine and actually to influence politics in many countries, including France, including the UK, including the United States. So it's very, very important to understand that Russia weaponizes the word, weaponizes information, and to actually, you know, protest against this, to be efficient against this war.
You've actually been face-to-face, as we are now, with Vladimir Putin.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, it happened in 2019, and that was the only personal meeting of President Zelensky with Putin. And I guess that was the only one, because Putin showed himself as a very weak negotiator. Right now, I can openly say, look, he's the guy who's been for over 20 years in power. He is not used to negotiate. When he sat down there at the table together with Zelensky, with Chancellor Merkel, and with President Macron, and then Zelensky was persistent, and he was very diplomatic, and he tried to negotiate. Putin was lost. He did not own the information. He didn't expect that some novice in politics as Zelensky would own this information. He was asking his advisors all the time about what to do, how to move forward. He looked down. He didn't feel comfortable sitting on the chair. You know, all of Putin showed that he was not comfortable sitting and negotiating. And I think that's why he never met Zelensky again. But also there is another impression. When I saw him and his delegation, I understood that he is the person from the past. He was so outdated. His wording, his moves, his thoughts, they were outdated. And I think everything that he does right now in Ukraine is also all those horrors from the past. The genocidal practices, the World War II practices, the famine that used to be in Ukraine, now he tries to expand it around the world. So this proves that he is from the past. And I hope that such people will not have the future and the influence on the future.
Yulia, we're getting to the final moments of this special program. In terms of the next year ahead for Volodymyr Zelensky, how important is the right move, the right next move?
You know, the President Zelensky and Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian people, we all have the will and we have the determination to stand against this aggressive and unpredictable autocracy to the very end. This is the battle of Goliath and David must win. But the West and the civilized world must understand that the unity is even more important right now than before, because we actually showed that we can win, and the victory, it's not far, but we will not be able to cope alone. So, you know, Ukraine never asks for something that is not necessary. We don't ask for something luxury. We ask to give us the modern weaponry, because this is not the war of spares. So we can win, but please stand with us, because we are not fighting here for the land or for Ukraine. We are fighting here for the freedom and for democracy as it's understood in every part of this civilized world.
Yulia Mendel, former press secretary to President Zelensky. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here for our special programme. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your analysis with us. We appreciate it. Thanks to our other guests, Ines Sovson and to Peter Zalmayev for their thoughts. Thanks to our correspondents, Catherine Norris-Trent, and of course our Chief Foreign Editor, Robert Parsons, joined us earlier from Mykolaiv and Kramatorsk. This is the end of our programme. We'll leave you with a look back at some of the most striking images, and there have been many of the past year here in Ukraine. Thanks for being with us, and stay with us here on France 24.